What Justice Looks Like in Black and White. Hosted by Harold Fisher, this three-part virtual town hall edition will address the current unrest around the country. You'll hear from activists and legal and political experts.
We are out here. We are scared.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Harold Fisher. This is part 2 of our special 3-part series on the Daily Drum, Justice in Black and White, an examination of issues that have come into focus since the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Tonight's focus, the 2 pandemics, preventing further harm and healing the pain. This program can be heard on 96.3 WHUR, Sirius XM Channel 141, WHUR.com, and streaming on all of our digital platforms. Tonight's program will also be rebroadcast at 10 o'clock on our sister station, WHUT-TV, Channel 32. Now, of course, we are not taking any phone calls tonight, but you can join the conversation using the hashtag WHUR-FM. My guests tonight are Dr. Reed Tuckson, chair of the Black Coalition Against COVID-19 and Howard University trustee, Dr. Niambi Carter, associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Howard University and author of the book American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship. Also with us, Timothy Williams, an expert in police procedure, use of force, and wrongful convictions. And finally, we have the Reverend Mark Thompson, civil rights organizer. I want to thank all of you for sharing in this really important conversation. I want to get right into this. Let me first start with you, Timothy. Talk to me a little bit about where you see we are right now. Where do we go from this point? We've had the protests and unfortunately the civil unrest. We had the funeral for George Floyd today in Minneapolis. What's the next step?
Well, the next step, and thanks for having me. The next step is that we've got to come to the table. When I say we, the stakeholders in the community, you got to bring the faith community, you've got to bring the educational community, you've got to bring the business community, you got to bring law enforcement, you got to bring all the stakeholders that make a community, and come to the table and do some meaningful discussion, and with that discussion, implement meaningful and concise reform in the criminal justice system. Secondly, there needs to be a federal oversight in that in the law enforcement organizations under this administration. We will not see that. I'm talking about in the area of consent decrees, and hopefully that will come back because those consent decrees have teeth. They have federal oversight by the federal courts, and things can be mandated. The third thing is that, as it relates to the coherent change in the system, is that you've got to look at what's coming in the system. When I say coming in the system, those individuals who are becoming officers, making sure that they have the proper core values. And then the fourth thing is that you need to have proper leadership. Leadership is key. I can't overemphasize that. You have, and I don't want to paint anyone with a broad brushstroke, but you have good chiefs out there. Then you have chiefs that shouldn't even be running an organization. They don't have a coherent or creative thought in their mind. And what you see, they go from one agency to another, and you recycle the same bad leadership all across the country. Then you have to, with that leadership, you have to hold supervision accountable. You have to hold, that's the frontline management. You have to hold the watch commanders accountable. You have to hold the commanding officers accountable. At the end of the day, everything falls at the feet of that chief. And the fifth thing is the civic responsibility. These mayors hire and appoint these chiefs. The city council ratifies their decision, and all these are elected officials. Well, that means that the public has to come out and question these individuals and vote coherently. In other words, you got to put square pegs in square holes and quit putting round pegs in square holes.
Well, let me ask Dr. Carter about this, because I think the important thing about that, I think that's some really great foundational stuff. But we have the political will today, but America has short memories. Will we have the political will tomorrow, literally Friday or July or after November?
Well, I mean, I think this is the perennial question because this is not the first time we've been here, right? I mean, we can talk about Rodney King, we can talk about Freddie Gray just a few years ago. We've been in this place before, maybe not quite to this extent because we've never had COVID-19 before. But we've certainly been in this place before and we've seen many of the same results because people talk a good game, right? And we think leadership changes lead to better outcomes. But I think part of the issue here is that there is something really rotten in this system, right? And you can change all the leadership you want. You can change all the members of the city council that you want, but we have to really talk about what's sort of undergirding all of this violence in a sense, right? If you don't view Black people as fully human, then it's very difficult to think about humane strategies to working with that community. And I think this is part of what that conversation is missing. So yes, all of the things that we can pull in terms of the levers of politics will get us so far, but these sort of fundamental questions about how people think about these communities that they're entering and who lives there and whether those people are all sort of criminals until proven otherwise, I think are the deeper issues that we are needing to engage with and which some of these protesters are talking about, right? When they're talking about defund the police, they don't mean like, hey, we want the police gone altogether, but they're talking about how do we get to the root causes of things that lead to maybe criminal activity or even mischief, right? Not even things that rise to the level of crime, but maybe nuisances, right? How do we get here? Right, so we can avoid people having contact with the criminal justice system. And I think these are the kinds of questions that keep coming up over and over and over again. And we also have to deal with police unions, right? I mean, in many cities and many localities, police unions exercise an extraordinary amount of power. And I think that is also a problem because if nobody can police the police, then that leaves the citizens much more vulnerable, right, than they would be otherwise. And so I think there are a lot of things that politics can do, but there are also things that we have to do as a community. We want to soul search and figure out, and politics can't fix those.
Yeah,
Blackness.
Mark, let me talk to you specifically. You know, as a civil rights activist, we've long heard that we cannot legislate prejudice. So how do we fix the obvious issues that have arisen over the past several weeks as it relates to prejudice? I mean, even today, it came out that in court that the men behind the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia uttered a racial epithet during his last seconds on earth. How do we fix that?
Well, first of all, let me thank you all for having me here on WHUR and Miss HUR, Mr. Daily Drum, and all the good work that was done.
Well, thank you so much.
I should also say it's meaningful to be here in the very building or the very building adjacent to where you are. That's the building I was born in when my mother was a senior at Howard University. So the School of C, Kathy Hughes School of Communications is in my blood.
Okay.
You know, you can't legislate this away. I agree, and greetings to all of your esteemed guests, all of whom I admire. It's going to be necessary to organize, but especially on the local level. Police are governed locally. And unfortunately, the struggle against police violence, to your point, Harold, you know, we tend to move on. But we move on because sometimes I think the way we approach it is from 30,000 feet in the air. And today that's even more so because, you know, social media is great, but social media can't necessarily touch the politics on the ground. And I'm hearing from young people and those who work with young people that they are so upset with everything right now and so upset with the system. Once again, no surprise, we're having the conversation with young people. They're asking, what is the point in voting? Because nothing ever changes. So we've got a lot of education to do to show that when you vote, especially local level, you affect the local elected officials, mayors, city council, et cetera, county commissioners, city commissioners that pick these chiefs of police, that help to determine policy. And so it's going to take that. I don't know that we know when racism will end or where we'll change people's hearts. These are good signs, though, because people all over the world, black and white and other races and colors and creeds, are standing up and putting their bodies on the line, even in the midst of this pandemic. And as I think about the history of WHUR, I remember every night WHUR and Subri Governor reported from the battlefront in apartheid South Africa. As long as Donald Trump's in office, as long as we're being lynched in this modern day way, we're in an apartheid state. And so when I was on the BBC this week and they asked, what can we do? I'll say this, some of us have begun a conversation about bringing the band back together. We may have to go to the world community in the way that our sisters and brothers in South Africa did and ask them to continue to cry out on our behalf, one, but also to seriously consider a divestment campaign from this country as long as Donald Trump is in office and as long as this police terror reigns. We need help, and it's going to take a lot.
Let me talk to Dr. Tuxson. Dr. Tuxson, from your position, as a physician, and you and I have spoken on this program before about the first pandemic of 2020, which is COVID-19. I'm sure you saw the funeral for George Floyd in Minneapolis, snippets of it. Were you at all concerned about the threat of the coronavirus during the course of that service? There was little social distancing. There was a lot of touching, handshakes, hugs, the like.
It's a great question. And let's be real clear that these are some very, very torturous kinds of issues to work through. I think I understand that moral outrage requires moral responsibility, that there is no question that the case for protest is made. It is there. It is legitimate. It is clear. It is unequivocal. On the other hand, just as the case for the coming together to honor our brother at the funeral, the question for community and public grieving, it's there. It's unequivocal. However, yes, you have to be concerned about that, as well as what's happening with some of the elements of the protest, because it is inevitable that this kind of coming together in the way that we are coming together, whether it's through the funeral or through some of the elements of the protest, will inevitably cause more people to transmit the virus. And we already are experiencing an extraordinary, disproportionate impact of that virus on our people. So I think we have a very fine line to walk. And what I would continue to say, and we will, I'm sure, get into more details as the conversation unfolds, but what is the morally responsible way to exhibit your moral outrage through protest? And that really becomes something that we have to have a very serious conversation. And I hope as the conversation evolves, we can get into some of that.
Well, let's talk about that. I'll go back to you, Dr. Carter. How do you balance that, the two pandemics, as it relates to the focus of this conversation, where you have a concern about people getting sick, particularly Black folks who have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus, and Black folks who have been disproportionately impacted by racism in this country?
Well, I think it's interesting that on the day that we lay Mr. Floyd to rest, it was also revealed that he had survived COVID-19, right? I think that's something to think about. I don't know what the appropriate response is, because again, we're talking about a virus that kills Black people at 3 times the rate as it does white Americans. And these are things that are really concerning, especially when we talk about things like funerals and gatherings where you want to be close to other people, where you're in a protest, where you actually are arm in arm in some cases with other people. I think we would be remiss if we talked about the police violence without talking about the COVID-19, because to me, they are both symptoms of the same source, right? The same thing that makes Black people more vulnerable to this is the same disregard for Black life that makes them more vulnerable to police violence. So I think it's a difficult thing to tell people, hey, don't protest, there's a pandemic. But it's also irresponsible to suggest that the pandemic is solved. We know we've had a woefully inadequate response in this country to this pandemic, and this is a very real threat to those people's lives. So in addition to fighting off or working through the militarized police forces in some of these cities that are being deployed to manage these protesters, we're also talking about the fact that people are likely putting themselves at risk in these very same protests for COVID-19. So it's a double-edged sword. I don't think that social justice can wait. At the same time, how do we exercise the caution that is needed at this time? Because we know it's still a very dangerous time. We have not gotten this thing under control by any stretch. And these very same communities that are out here protesting are many of those same communities that are especially vulnerable to this virus.
Timothy, you saw the video, as we all have, the last minutes of George Floyd's life. Black people have been saying in this country since the very beginning of organized policing that there are difficult elements in police departments. How do you separate the wheat from the chaff in that regard?
Well, I was on the department in 1992 when we had the Los Angeles riots, and at the end of the riots, we've heard the same discussion, and 28 years later, we're here with the demise of George Floyd, and we're having the same discussion. Having been in this business going on 48 years, I think I kind of know the issues and the handles and the things that need to be addressed. I have a book. I wrote a book, a deep dive, an expert analysis of police procedure and use of force and wrongful convictions, and I talk about these things. I talked about the same issue that George Floyd died on, and the deep dive that goes into the analysis of all that. But the thing is that Dr. King said, and I think it's rightly so, and it has that phrase has withstood the ages. We as a people have a hypertension of words and anemia of deeds. In other words, we do a whole lot of talking and really nothing follows through. So I'm hoping that 6 months from now, a year from now, that the same police officers, the same firefighters, the same community is still taking that right knee. I'm hoping 6 months from now, a year from now, that there be some meaningful dialogue, not only dialogue, but some action to make change in this criminal justice system in our country. My thing is doing one city at a time, and guess what's going to happen? That one city is going to catch on to the next city, and the next city is going to catch on to the next city, and then you will see the change. But we got to quit talking, and we got to do. We got to quit talking about it and be about it.
Well said. I just want to remind our viewers and listeners that this is part 2 of our special 3-part series here on the Daily Drum, Justice in Black and White, an examination of issues that have come into focus since the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And tonight's focus is the 2 pandemics, preventing further harm and healing the pain. Now, if you have a comment or a question, you can certainly send it to Facebook on WHUR's Facebook page. We certainly invite you to participate in this conversation. Of course, we will post that and try to address that conversation during the course of this conversation. I want to talk a little bit more about the protests, because is there any way, Dr. Tuckson, to protest safely right now? Cities are opening up, but whether they are opening up or not for business and some sense of new normalcy, right now the new normal continues to be tens of thousands of people in the street. How,
Yeah, I think it's
can
very
we have our
important.
voices heard and be safe?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's important that you also added that other context. In the middle of the protest movement going on, there's also the reopening. And it's also people deciding that they've had enough of being inside, so they're going out. So a lot of factors, all of which are negative to the spread of this disease is going forward. But if you have made first of all, the protesting community is multiple. Let's get rid of the agents and provocateurs. Those people need to leave us alone, get away. There's nothing to be said about those people whatsoever. There's some people, a few, who are out there simply because of entertainment purposes, and it's exciting. Those people are acting irresponsibly. These are not people with a moral outrage for whom moral responsibility is important. But the overwhelming majority of them, Harold, is what you're asking. The overwhelming majority of people on the streets are responsible people making a considered decision. If they're going to do that, number one, you've got to remember to wear your mask. It's absolutely true. Number two, add to your mask goggles. This pepper spray and those kinds of things are causing people to tear up, to cough, and to cry, and those bodily fluids get spread. Wow. So you've got to decide to wear a mask. Number three, you've got to do your best at social distancing. It makes no sense to crowd up a body to body up against a fence. That doesn't do anything. It doesn't make a good visual, and it's stupid, and it will kill you. So stay back and keep your distance and walk apart from other people. Besides, it makes it look great. So many people in the line. Next thing is, don't share megaphones and don't share water when you get home. And Dr. Carter made an important point. Not only are you risking yourself, I want to extend, Dr. Carter, you're risking everybody you know. So when you go home, make sure that you wash your clothes right away. You wash your hands. And if you are living with someone who is older or who has a pre-existing condition, you have to socially isolate yourself. You have no moral authority to protest and then kill somebody in your own family. Just like you can't breathe when a policeman puts his knee on your neck, we can't breathe when that virus comes into our alveolar sacs in our lungs and fills them with fluid. So if you have a moral imperative to criticize not being able to breathe in the society, you cannot take that home and cause the people in your own home not to be able to breathe. So we have to do all those things. And one last thing, we have to, and this is why I'm so irritated and angry at these agents and provocateurs who provoke the police to use these tear gas and other inhalants that cause the propensity of this disease to spread. Stay away from those crazy people. If you are in an environment where you see that, move. You're doing nothing but to hurt yourself and other people. But I would do all of those things. Wear your mask every single time you're there. But by the way, if you get caught with the tear gas, it's very difficult to wear your mask because you're irritated. Stay away from the crazy people. Don't get near where there has to be tear gas. It doesn't do any good. Wear your goggles, socially distance, don't crowd up, don't share megaphones, don't share water, wash everything. And if you're living around people that are vulnerable, you got to socially isolate. That's just the way the game goes.
Mm-hmm. Mark, let me ask you a similar question as it relates to this new civil rights, human rights protest, not just here in America, but now around the world, sparked by the horrific George Floyd video. What impact do you believe the COVID-19 pandemic is having on it? Would it be any different if there were no coronavirus right now?
Oh, yeah, it'd be a whole lot different. And I agree with every word that Dr. Tuxton said and Brother Timothy said on this. First of all, I think it is very dangerous for people to be out demonstrating. I live here in the epicenter in New York. I have not been out for that reason, as a middle-aged Black man raising a son who graduates and turns 18 this weekend. I can't risk anything happening to me. Now, maybe after this weekend, because those of you who know me, this, protest in the street is in my blood, but it's just too big of a risk. Now, maybe after his 18th birthday and graduation, I'll decide to go out Monday in a blaze of glory. But not only would that not be very responsible, it's very, very dangerous for everyone, even around the world. And I fear that there will be a spike after this. And again, that's where the challenge comes in, as Timothy was saying. As I said earlier, this happens on the local level. We have civilian complaint review, for example, in Washington, D.C., because we struggled at the local level. We came just short of, before Marion Barry left office, civilian oversight. And these are the type of things that communities need to struggle for. Colorchange.org, Movement for Black Lives, have been promoting these principles. The Zero campaign have been promoting principles that local communities can get around, but it takes some discipline. I must say that we have to be very, very careful, all of us who are activists, that we don't mistake likes and shares and retweets and all of that on social media and reposts for actual tangible movement. All right, because we see those numbers and we think that this is something, but we need to be right there on the ground in our local communities, putting pressure on entities within the community to withdraw financial support from the police department, to put pressure on city leaders, mayors, and what have you, to redistribute funds, our tax dollars, away from the police so that they'll stop lynching us. And then also put pressure locally on politicians not to be so beholden to these police unions. Now, we had a big breakthrough last week when the National Fraternal Order of Police even came out. I don't think they've ever done anything like this before. Even they admitted that the killing of George Floyd was wrong. But yeah, you know, those are things we can do in the long term that are even more important and more long-standing and more effective than going out like, you know, in a flash in the pan in the middle of a pandemic and risking our lives.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Carter, as it relates to the risk being worth the reward, we've seen the activities over the past week or so kind of move that the needle towards justice. But beyond that, are these protests in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic part of a sacrifice that just must be made?
I don't know if it must be made in this way, because I think Mark is exactly right. There's a lot that can happen at the local level, right, that we can think about. But again, we've never been in this moment, right, protesting in the midst of a pandemic. And so we have to be thinking about different ways that we can be effective. So for sure, I mean, I think it's a noble thing. I don't think anyone here is suggesting that people don't follow their hearts, but we also know that it can be a very foolhardy thing also, right? I mean, many of us, I mean, I have elderly parents, you know, or have people who have other conditions like hypertension, diabetes, and other things that make them particularly vulnerable. So these are very perilous times. And so if we think that the police won't kill us, the virus certainly can do that as well in very short order. And so I think we have to be mindful that if we have these other tools where we can organize and think about another kind of strategy, because people keep talking about November 3rd, but that's an election, right? We have a lot more at stake in local communities. Not to say that the president doesn't matter. We absolutely know he does. He's terribly mismanaged this whole crisis. But we also know that this is not our last bite at the apple, right? If you voted in DC this week, you know that there are city council seats that are up for grabs, right, that you need to be paying attention to. And so there are a lot of things that we can use, the very tools that we use to organize these protests for, to organize different kinds of coordinated actions, because different moments call for different strategies, right? We cannot be asking people, I don't think it's fair to say, go out here and potentially kill yourself, right? I don't know that necessarily does what we think it's going to do. It's noble, perhaps, but I think it may be short-sighted, because we need this energy and we need this activism for years to come, because these are centuries-old problems. They're not going away in 2 months or 2 weeks, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think it's something we have to think about, because this pandemic, even though we have hardly talked about it in these last few weeks because of these protests, in this last week because of these protests, it's still here.
Absolutely. And certainly there is a concern that we will be talking about it a lot more as the year goes on. And I think that is something that everyone needs to keep in the forefront. I want to thank Reverend Mark Thompson for sharing with us. I know that you have another commitment, but I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts, your wisdom, and your expertise in this regard. And we certainly wish you the best and continued good health for you and your son. So
Yes, congratulations.
Thank you so much. God bless you all. Good to see you all. Thank you.
And we also now would like to welcome Matthew Horus, who is the author of the book, The Black and the Blue, A Cop Reveals the Crimes, Racism, and Injustice in America's Law Enforcement. Matt, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Good evening, Harold, once again.
Absolutely. I want to start with you as we talk about this conversation. One of the things that I'm sure has been particularly difficult for people like yourself, former law enforcement, is to watch the horrific video of what happened to George Floyd. And there have been discussions not only just in this forum, but about conversations about defunding or reducing the funding for police departments. What are your thoughts about that?
I heard that earlier about out in Seattle, there was some push towards that. I don't know that defunding policing will help our communities in the way that we need, because we still need police services. We just need good police services. And that's a lot of what we talk about in the book. When you call 911, you want help, but you want to know who's coming, and you want to know which type of officer is going to be showing up. So I don't know that defunding is the answer. I've always maintained, and we talk about it in the book over and over, that recruitment, hiring, training, and accountability really is the answer, followed by sweeping criminal justice reform to get to the point where we're not seeing these sorts of things. This thing in Minneapolis was a travesty on every level. And this whole idea about the thin blue line and not telling on your partners and not getting involved, it's horrible on every level.
Mm-hmm. Timothy, what do you think about that? Same question about reducing funding. I mean, that's such a broad thing when you're talking about cutting back the money for police departments, even in the context of where we are right now.
Well, having worked in law enforcement for almost 30 years and having worked at the highest level in the organization, I don't support that. The thing is that what's going to happen, you're going to take away the services that are needed in our minority communities. You're going to take away the what little bit of programs that are working in some of the communities. They're going to be gone. What the mayors should be doing is trying to find funds to implement or to infuse into the community to assist to assist the minority communities to get the services, to enhance the service, or to enhance their communities to the point where where what we see now is not a common thread. I was listening to BBC this morning on the way in, and there was a discussion about the minority communities and about the underground funding, which is in dealing with narcotics, prostitutions, and these types of things. Well, what law enforcement should be doing is doing some effective constitutional policing to dissuade this type of activity in our minority communities. Bringing in the business community, again, I talk about the stakeholders again, bringing in the stakeholders so that as you deal with these things, you can put something in its place so that these issues won't come back. Again, that goes with the creativity of the leadership. If you're doing the same thing, Einstein says, you do the same thing over and over again, well, that's a sign of insanity. And there's a whole lot of insanity on display in this country. I did about 4 interviews this week with foreign press, and the world's watching this country. And they all ask me, what is happening in the United States? What's happening in the minority communities? It's like they'd never seen this before, because of what happened with George Floyd. Mm-hmm. You see, yeah. But the thing is that, as I tell them, this has been going on longer than I've been living, and it was going on before my parents were born. Just so happened, technology has changed and has uncovered the ugliness of America, and we see what's been going on for decades and decades. Now it's incumbent upon us to try to do something about that, not try, but to do something about that and make a change. We can make a change, but we need to go about it. It's not going to be easy. You got to roll up your sleeves, and it's hard work. It's not going to happen in 1 year, 5 years. You're talking about a 10 or 20-year process. But if you do it, it can and will be done.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
I think Timothy's made a good point. Let me look at it the same point, though, through a different lens. The way in which money is used to solve and deal with social problems is an art form, and it's something that requires great sophistication. No one, I think, is going to be supportive of decreasing the budget for police department because at the time we need that service. In fact, I think just the opposite fear. As a public health official and as the former commissioner of health in DC, I watched persistently the public health budget cut over and over again for the sake of the police department and the criminal justice system because of the challenges that we were facing during the time that I was there. Public health is being cut back drastically across this country, and military budgets at the federal level and police budgets and so forth at the local level will increase. I'm very concerned about that. But what I'm really more interested in is how we bring those two communities together. They're really not that different in many important ways. If you think about the community demand for a conversation with our police about what is our shared vision for what a safe city looks like? What is our shared vision for what a protected community environment looks like? Is the same exercise that we have to have for what is a healthy city look like? What does are the elements that requires for us to have the kind of a health infrastructure that allows each individual to maximize their own God-given human potential? Those two conversations should not be occurring separate. They're all part of one sense of a vision that we all have about the way we want to live our lives. And so what I would urge is that as we put forward money and have conversations about certainly training the police, which is essential, and as we start thinking about the role of the police in our society, let's make it a conversation about what is the society that we are looking for? What is the environment that we have to say? How do we give ourselves a safety that allows our children to go outside and have their childhood back? How do our kids jump rope and play in the street so they can be healthy? How can seniors walk so that they prevent the diabetes that Dr. Carter talked about? You can't walk in our community if you're afraid of being hit in the head by somebody. So these are all interrelated. And so my only point ultimately is that money and the way you use money to affect social change does not have us walled off in our compartments. If we were intelligent, we would use money and budgets to bring the pieces together in a coherent, multidisciplinary whole.
Yeah, and I think
Wait a minute, go ahead, Dr. Carter.
I was just saying, I think what Dr. Tutson is talking about is what some of these defund advocates are talking about, right? Is that it's not to say that we don't think that there should be any police at all, although there are those who say let's abolish it altogether. But what most people are saying is many of the things that we're asking police to respond to, like mental health distress and other things that they're not trained for, would be better served if we actually had community mental health, which we used to have, but we defunded essentially, right? So that doesn't exist as a thing anymore. That's what my mother started in as a therapist in Prince George's County. And those things are gone. So you're asking police to do things that they're actually not trained to do. And then there are also those who say, well, these underground economies that Mr. Williams was talking about a moment ago are funded by something. So what is that something? Let's get to that, right? And perhaps we might even want to think about decriminalizing certain kinds of things, right? Perhaps sex work, for example, so that it perhaps leads to harm reduction. So I think there are a lot of conversations when we just use the word defund the police that are happening, and they're not all the same thing, but they're probably more of let's spend less time trying to lock people up and more time trying to figure out why people are turning to certain activities or behaviors in the first place, right? Rec leagues, which we know are great things to have, particularly in the summertime when schools are closed, are not available. So this is maybe a prime time for mischief. So what does that look like? right? How can we be creative with what we have so we bring about a better life, not just for the citizens, but even law enforcement officials? I'm sure there are many people who are doing parts of their job, like in some places where they're doing quasi-immigration enforcement, that they don't want to do and that they're not trained for, right? And so that we can think about this as being a both and proposition, because police officers are also members of these same communities, right? They live somewhere. They're not separate from us.
Now, let's talk about that. We have a Facebook comment, and this goes to the heart of that. And I want Matt to take a look at this. Toussaint Werner, he says, he's asking, how do you train beyond implicit biases, that exist in as many Black police officers as white police officers, whether they are in the community that we live in, or as we have seen in the DC Metro, we have officers that come from outside of the community, policing communities that they have no ties to. Matt, your thoughts about that?
Well, training is one thing, but enforcing the rules and regulations and policies of the department are a whole different thing. And, there's this idea that you can legislate behavior, but you can't legislate hearts. So many departments do have these training initiatives to teach officers about self-awareness and implicit biases, but you still have these things happening because you haven't gotten to their hearts. I love the organizations with, we talked last time, Harold, and said, from a leadership perspective, that culture eats strategy for lunch sometimes. So even the greatest leaders with the greatest ideas and the greatest programs and training still fail oftentimes because you're not getting to the core. The one thing I like about what happened in Minneapolis last week, the only thing from a police standpoint was that they fired the officer immediately, the one officer, not fast enough in the eyes of some. And then obviously they fired all four at the same time, but now they've all been charged. There needs to be a disincentive for this type of behavior. I heard in Colorado today, they're moving towards legislation that would enable people to sue police officers personally in areas where there's a civil rights violation. And they're also moving for legislation so that if police officers are terminated or charged with excessive force, they can't be hired in other police departments. So I think at the end of the day, we got to start to hit people where it hurts the most and, take this risk out of our communities. And that's where you're going to get some of these answers.
Dr. Tuckson, you wanted to talk about an announcement regarding families of COVID-19.
Yes, I do. And by the way, one other thing, I want to amend the other advice that I gave around mask, goggles, social distancing, and so forth and so on, to also say that if you are also around people who are vulnerable when you go back home, you should, and you have to socially isolate, get tested. And the mayor made an announcement today, I thought very responsibly, the mayor, around increasing availability of testing. The announcement I want to make is that just as we believe and understand that Black lives matter, Black deaths have to matter too, that our dignity has to be upheld when we die. COVID, one of the terrible things about COVID is that you die alone in the hospital and the funerals are small and we don't get to mourn as a community. The Black Coalition Against COVID is hosting with WHUR, WHUT, WPFW, the Washington Informer on June 14th at 11 to 12, a time for remembrance of those families that have lost a loved one from COVID. We need to elevate this up. Those lives cannot be lost in the dark of night, in the quiet, and the silence. We have to have a chance to mourn as a community. I'm asking anyone out there who has a family who lost a loved one, contact me immediately. I'm going to give you my personal phone number, 612-839-4810, 612-839-4810. We need to hear from you. We want to put you on the air and have you a part of this day of celebration. At the end of the day, we have to realize that if Black lives matter, Black deaths have to matter, and we have to honor our own. And this is what the Black Coalition Against COVID is doing.
So I need to go back to today's funeral in Minneapolis for George Floyd, because as I said in the very beginning of this discussion, very influential Black folks were in that funeral. They were participating there. They were in the audience. You had, you had T.I., you had Kevin Hart, you had some others. There was no social distancing. Tiffany Haddish was there. She had on a mask. Kevin Hart did not. but he was sitting next to Tiffany Haddish. And like you said, if Black lives matter, Black health matters, and just sitting there and watching the people in that audience gave so many mixed messages. I'm raising my hand. I'm saying, help me here, Doc, because there's no clarity here.
No clarity. And at the end of the day, what the really scary part is when we send these, it means that our young people don't get the message and they think it is okay to be loose and to be relaxed. And so I think one of the things we have to do is start holding our people accountable for their behavior. Again, I come back to what this is about for me. Moral outrage requires moral responsibility. One of the things that we're happy about, at least in our city, is we got our big G Glover from the Backyard Band. We've been working with the Black Coalition in COVID along with the bus system. We're going to be, you'll see his face coming in the next couple of days on the buses, him wearing a mask and saying, I wear mine, you wear yours. We need every legitimate voice in our community to keep the pressure on and not get loose. And so I'm really, really hoping that our celebrities will be called to task and say, excuse me, Kevin, we appreciate you were there, but look at the message gave to our children. That's irresponsible, my brother. We love you, we care about you, but stop doing stupid things.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Carter, you're nodding your head.
Absolutely, because I walk around with a mask at all times, even if I'm not around people, I keep it in my pocket, right? Just in case I get near or something, right? I run, so it's hard to run with a mask, but I always have it on my neck or somewhere around me just to go in the store. And I'm riding through my neighborhood or I'm in communities and people have nothing on, right? I mean, seeing people with small children, nothing on, right? I mean, it is distressing, right? Because I mean, it's like, am I getting a different set of news than somebody else? And maybe because one of my relatives is an immunologist, so he's always like, look, watch it, right? Like it doesn't need a lot of room, right? It's a virus. You can't see it. But I mean, it is distressing when you see people out as if nothing is wrong. And I think this partial reopening also sent a really bad message because everyone was saying it's too soon. We understand the economic constraints, but it's too soon. And yet we did it anyway. And so I saw people hanging out, you know, on patios, having lunch the other day. And I'm just like, this is not okay, but we're doing it. And so I think there are so many bad messages coming, not just from celebrities, but even our legislators and our leaders, right? That it's safe to open it. I mean, because I think that gives the impression that even though you can't sit inside, even though, you know, you have to stay 6 feet apart, it still says things are reasonably safe when we know they're not.
Mm-hmm. I have another Facebook question. I think this is a really good question. I'll post this one for Tim. Apostle Frank Burton Jr. says, how do we recognize provocateurs for disrupting our protests? What should we look for, and what are they bringing to, they're bringing chaos, is what he's saying. How do they're bleeding into the crowd?
Well, as I was observing the protests across the country, there was one thing that stood out. These protests, number one, were very organized, and number two, it was embedded in these protests individuals who were up to no good. There was a vignette. I don't know if you guys saw this. I think it was in Minnesota, where this white girl was spray painting on the side of the business, "Black Lives Matter." So happened that Black Lives Matter person was there and asked her what she was doing. She was saying that, you know, Black Lives Matter don't, you know, we don't deface, we don't loot, we don't do that. We protest and we march. And the white girl says, well, some black person told me to do this. Well, see, now what if that wasn't caught on television? Now you have Black Lives Matter has a blemish of saying, well, they're out there doing all this, they're doing all this, and they, in fact, are not doing that. I do a lot of testifying in both state and federal court in both criminal and civil rights cases, and Black Lives Matter are there from time to time. And I tell you, they comport themselves very well in court. There was never been no problems. The judges never had to say anything.
Yeah.
So the media has given them a bad jacket for, I don't say for some reason, I know the reason, but just giving them a bad jacket. The thing is that, as you go out there's a planned agenda for these protests. Now, hopefully these implants are gone now, but when dusk comes,
Yeah,
here they come.
yeah.
Here they come.
I only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to give everyone about 30 seconds to kind of make a final point. Matt, I'll start with you, and I'll put my hand up because I've got a hard out. But please, your final thoughts here.
I just think that now's the time. We all need to come together and need to push for sweeping criminal justice reform in whatever ways that's meaningful in your own communities. We can't take the foot off the pedal, just like the officer's knee was on the neck.
Yeah, a very, very important point. Dr. Carter, your final thoughts about the political climate and where we are in these two pandemics. You got a minute or so.
I think the political climate is dire. I think it's more important now than ever that people be participatory. I know that you may be disenchanted. I know that you may not feel motivated, but we cannot do 4 more years of Donald Trump. And if you can't bring yourself to vote in the actual election for the president, think about the down ballot races. You have local community offices to vote for. You have state wide offices in some cases to vote for. Vote for those, because those are also really important to your life. So think about this holistically. Wear your mask, wash your hands, social distance, and stay a safe distance away from other people, and watch all those excretions from your eyes and other places.
Spoken like a true Howard University professor.
I can't talk anymore. But yes.
Yeah, Tim, I'll give you a minute to share your final thoughts, and we can.
Okay, sure. I think I've seen a lot during my professional career, and I think the clarion call has come. I think that this is not about advocacy. This is about civic responsibility. I think that we need to come together, like Dr. Tuckson's taught his comments about public health. No one entity can do this by themselves, but collectively we can come together, make a major change in our communities that will metastasize itself, if I can use some medical terms here, metastasize itself all across the country for positiveness. And I think that we need to, again, talk is great, but we need to roll up our sleeves, sit down, and make some meaningful changes and implement them in our local communities that will go up through the state and federal levels. And we may not be around to see the change, but one thing for sure, a change will come.
Indeed, so well said. I'm interested to see how police reform moves from this point forward. I think it'll be very interesting to watch, particularly as we go into this political season, not only, perhaps changing leadership at the top, but like Dr. Carter said, down ballot. Dr. Tuckson, I'll let you have the last word.
What we at the Black Coalition Against COVID are saying and understand is no people but a people can save a people. Calvin Rolock taught me that. All I'm urging is every community leader come together. Let's all stitch together. It would take all of us fighting this common enemy, and above all, do the right thing. This virus ain't over. The virus ain't tired. The virus did not take a vacation. The virus doesn't care about social policy. It is going to be there. Do the right thing. Go to our website, blackcoalitionagainstcovid.org, and let's figure out how you can join with us in this fight.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. Yesterday, former President Barack Obama said that the mayors have the power to make change in police departments. But like Dr. Carter said, whether you're a big city mayor that you're voted in, or whether you are a small town mayor who is appointed by a council, you still have to vote for that council. And so if you do not vote, all the marching in the world will not see the kind of change that so many people want. I want to thank all of you for participating in this really important conversation. It's important for us to continue to carry the banner here. So I want to thank you, Dr. Niambi Carter. I want to thank Timothy Williams, Matt Horus. Also, I would like to thank Reverend Mark Thompson, who was on earlier, as well as, of course, Dr. Reed Tuckson. Again, thank you all so very, very much. We want to thank you, our listeners and our viewers, for joining us for Justice in Black and White, a special virtual town hall edition of the Daily Drum. And of course, you can catch a rebroadcast of tonight's show on our sister station on WHUT TV, channel 32. That's at 10 o'clock tonight. And of course, we want to make sure that you join us tomorrow at 7 for part 3. It's titled, It Ain't Over, Minding Your Vote and Minding Your Business. This has been a special edition of the Daily Drum. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.
Thanks, Harold.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harold.
Thank you.